In the summer of 1274, the waters off the coast of Japan trembled under the weight of nearly 1,000 ships. Their hulls cut through the waves like knives, carrying with them the most feared army the world had ever known. At the head of this vast armada sailed warriors who had never tasted defeat, soldiers who had crushed kingdoms from the steppes of Mongolia to the gates of Europe. They came bearing the banners of Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, ruler of an empire that stretched across half the known world. Yet ahead of them lay something unprecedented in Mongol history, an enemy they could not simply overwhelm with superior numbers and battlefield tactics, an enemy that would teach these unstoppable conquerors the bitter taste of failure. This is the story of how nature itself rose up to defend Japan against the greatest military machine in history, how typhoons became weapons of war, and how the very gods seemed to take sides in a conflict that would define a nation's destiny for centuries to come. The Mongols had conquered China, crushed Korea, and brought entire civilizations to their knees. But Japan, isolated by treacherous seas and protected by forces beyond human control, would prove to be their greatest challenge and their most humiliating defeat. The year was 1274, and the world had never seen an empire like the one ruled by Kublai Khan. Stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, the Mongol Empire commanded territories so vast that messengers could ride for months without leaving its borders. At its heart sat Kublai, not just another Mongol warlord, but the founding emperor of China's Yuan dynasty, a man who commanded millions and whose word was law across half the civilized world. Yet for all his power, one prize remained tantalizingly out of reach. Across the narrow straits that separated the Asian mainland from the Japanese archipelago lay a collection of islands that had never bowed to foreign rule. Japan, with its proud samurai warriors and ancient traditions, stood as a defiant reminder that even the Mongol war machine had limits. Kublai's interest in Japan was not merely territorial ambition. The island nation represented valuable resources, profitable trade routes, and strategic influence in the Pacific. More importantly, it was a matter of imperial pride. How could the grandson of Genghis Khan claim to rule the world when a collection of islands remained outside his grasp? The diplomatic dance began in 1266, when Kublai dispatched his first envoy to the Japanese court. The message was polite but unmistakably threatening. The great Khan desired friendly relations with Japan, but he also expected recognition of his supremacy and the payment of tribute. To Kublai, this was a reasonable request. Every other nation had eventually submitted to Mongol authority, either through diplomacy or through the sword. But the Japanese response was unlike anything the Mongols had encountered. Silence, complete and utter silence. Letter after letter was sent across the sea, each more insistent than the last. Ambassadors were dispatched, carrying the weight of the Khan's authority and the implied threat of his armies. Yet Japan's leaders refused to acknowledge the communications, as if the greatest empire on earth simply did not exist. This diplomatic stonewalling was not born of ignorance or arrogance. Japan's rulers understood perfectly well what submission to the Mongols would mean. They had watched as China fell, as Korea was absorbed into the growing empire, as independent nations became tributary states paying homage to a distant Khan. The Japanese decision to ignore Kublai's demands was a calculated act of defiance, a declaration that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. By 1268, Kublai's patience was wearing thin. He sent a Chinese ambassador named Zhao Liangbi to Japan, a man who spent an entire year trying to foster understanding between the two nations. Zhao's reports back to the Khan were sobering. Japan might lack the wealth of China, he warned, but its people were warlike and fiercely independent. An invasion would not be the swift conquest that Mongol armies had grown accustomed to. The warning fell on deaf ears. In 1274, when yet another diplomatic mission returned empty-handed, Kublai made his decision. If Japan would not submit through diplomacy, it would be brought to heel through force. The greatest naval invasion in medieval history was about to begin. The preparations were staggering in their scope. Nearly 900 ships were gathered in Korean ports, ranging from massive warships capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers to smaller vessels packed with supplies and equipment. The army that would sail to Japan numbered somewhere between 16,000 and 40,000 men, a force drawn from across the Mongol Empire. Mongol cavalry experts, Chinese engineers skilled in siege warfare, Korean Marines familiar with naval combat, all united under the banner of the Khan. But this was not merely an army. It was a technological revolution sailing toward Japan's shores. The Mongol forces carried weapons and tactics that would be completely alien to Japanese warriors. Where samurai prized individual combat and personal honor, the Mongols fought in coordinated units with devastating efficiency. Where Japanese warfare relied on swords and bows, the invaders brought explosive devices that could shatter eardrums and terrify horses. Among the most revolutionary weapons in their arsenal were ceramic bombs filled with gunpowder and metal fragments. These primitive grenades represented some of the earliest use of gunpowder in warfare outside of China. When they exploded, they produced deafening blasts and clouds of deadly shrapnel that could incapacitate anyone within range. To samurai who had never encountered such weapons, these devices must have seemed like sorcery. On November 5th, 1274, the invasion began in earnest. The first Japanese territory to face the Mongol onslaught was Tsushima Island, a small outpost that served as an early warning system for the mainland. The island's defenders, led by So Sukekuni, fought with desperate courage against impossible odds. For days they held out, their small garrison standing firm against wave after wave of attackers. The Mongols were impressed by the ferocity of the defense, but numbers eventually told. Tsushima fell, its defenders overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the invasion force. 8 days later, Iki Island met the same fate. Led by Taira Kagetaka, the garrison made their final stand within Hinotsume Castle. When no reinforcements arrived from the mainland, they fought to the last man. These initial victories came at a cost that surprised the Mongol commanders. They had expected to sweep aside token resistance, not face warriors willing to die rather than surrender. The Japanese fighting spirit was unlike anything they had encountered in their previous conquests. By November 19th, the invasion fleet had reached Hakata Bay on the main island of Kyushu. Here would unfold the first major battle between Mongol forces and the full might of Japan's samurai class. The contrast in fighting styles was immediately apparent and devastating for the Japanese. Samurai warfare was built around concepts of individual honor and single combat. Warriors would ride out alone to challenge enemy champions to duels, announcing their names and lineages before engaging in one-on-one combat. This ritualized approach to battle had served them well in centuries of internal conflicts between rival clans. The Mongols had no interest in such ceremonies. When a samurai rode forward to issue his traditional challenge, he was immediately surrounded and cut down by multiple attackers. The invaders fought as a coordinated force, using group tactics that made individual prowess irrelevant. Their short bows had greater range than Japanese weapons, and their arrows were reportedly tipped with poison, making even minor wounds fatal. The technological gap was equally stark. Mongol explosive devices threw Japanese horses into panic, while the disciplined formations of infantry advanced with shield walls that absorbed samurai charges. For warriors accustomed to victory through personal skill and courage, this new form of warfare was both alien and terrifying. Despite their technological disadvantages, the Japanese defenders refused to break. The beaches of Hakata Bay became a killing ground where ancient traditions clashed with revolutionary warfare. Samurai warriors, many experiencing their first taste of coordinated enemy fire, watched their carefully honed skills rendered useless against an enemy that fought without honor or ceremony. The Mongol advance seemed unstoppable. Their forces established 3 main beachheads along the bay, with the primary assault focused on the central beach at Torikai. From there, they pushed inland toward Dazaifu, the administrative heart of Kyushu. Japanese resistance was fierce but disorganized, as local commanders struggled to adapt centuries-old tactics to face an enemy unlike any in their history. The invaders brought with them not just superior numbers, but a completely different philosophy of war. Where samurai sought glorious individual combat, Mongol soldiers operated as cogs in a vast military machine. Their cavalry charges were coordinated affairs, supported by archers who fired in volleys rather than seeking single targets. When Japanese defenders managed to break their lines, the Mongols simply regrouped and attacked from a different angle. Most terrifying of all were the explosive devices that punctuated the battle with thunderous roars. These ceramic shells, packed with gunpowder and metal fragments, created chaos in the Japanese ranks. Horses reared in terror at the unfamiliar sounds, throwing their riders into the mud. Warriors who had never heard such deafening blasts found themselves temporarily deafened and disoriented, easy targets for Mongol spears. Yet despite their overwhelming advantages, the Mongols found themselves facing unexpected challenges. The terrain around Hakata Bay was not the open steppes where their cavalry excelled, but a landscape of rice fields, forests, and narrow coastal strips that limited their mobility. Japanese defenders, fighting for their homeland, displayed a ferocity that impressed even hardened Mongol veterans. As the first day of battle drew to a close, the invasion force had established a foothold on Japanese soil, but they had not achieved the swift victory their commanders expected. The Japanese had been pushed back from the beaches, but they had not been routed. More concerning for the Mongols was the death of their general, Liu Fuxiang, struck down by a samurai arrow during the height of the fighting. As night fell on November 19th, the Mongol commanders faced a crucial decision. Their forces controlled the immediate beachhead, but pushing deeper into hostile territory with an enemy that fought so tenaciously would be costly. Supply lines stretched back across dangerous waters, and the approaching winter weather made extended campaigning risky. The decision was made to withdraw to the safety of their ships for the night. The fleet moved out into Hakata Bay, anchoring in what the commanders believed was a secure position. They would rest, resupply, and plan their next assault on Japanese positions. It seemed a reasonable tactical choice, one that would allow them to maintain their advantage while avoiding unnecessary risks. But the sea that had carried them to Japan's shores was about to become their greatest enemy. The late November weather was turning increasingly hostile, with winds picking up strength and dark clouds gathering on the horizon. What the Mongol commanders could not have known was that they were sailing directly into the path of one of nature's most destructive forces. The typhoon that struck Hakata Bay on the night of November 20th was unprecedented in its timing and fury. Pacific typhoons typically occur between May and October, making a late November storm almost unheard of. The timing seemed miraculous to Japanese observers, who had spent the day watching their ancient way of life tested by foreign invaders. The storm struck with devastating force. Winds that may have exceeded 150 miles per hour tore through the Mongol fleet like invisible claws, snapping masts and shredding sails. Ships that had weathered countless voyages across the East China Sea found themselves helpless against nature's fury. Massive waves, some reaching heights of 30 feet or more, crashed down on the anchored vessels with the force of hammers. In the chaos of the storm, the carefully organized Mongol fleet became a scene of maritime disaster. Ships collided with each other in the darkness, their hulls splintering under the impact. Others were driven against the rocky shores of Hakata Bay, where they broke apart in the pounding surf. The screams of drowning men mixed with the howl of the wind as thousands of soldiers found themselves cast into the churning waters. Those who managed to reach shore faced a different kind of hell. Japanese defenders, who had spent the day retreating before superior numbers, now found their enemies helpless and scattered. Small groups of samurai roamed the beaches, cutting down survivors who struggled ashore. The technological advantages that had dominated the day's fighting meant nothing when warriors were half drowned and separated from their weapons. By dawn on November 21st, the scene that greeted Japanese eyes was beyond their wildest hopes. The bay that had been filled with enemy ships now held only wreckage and debris. Bodies floated among the broken timbers, while the few surviving vessels limped away toward Korea, with their holds filled with wounded and demoralized men. The numbers were staggering. Of the nearly 1,000 ships that had carried the invasion force to Japan, fewer than half would make it back to Korean ports. Conservative estimates suggested that 13,000 Mongol soldiers had drowned in the typhoon, representing roughly 1/3 of the entire invasion force. The remainder faced a nightmarish retreat across hostile waters, pursued by Japanese vessels and harassed by the same weather that had saved their homeland. For Kublai Khan, receiving reports of the disaster in his court at Dadu, the failure was almost incomprehensible. His armies had conquered the largest cities in China, had brought entire civilizations to their knees, had never met an enemy they could not eventually overcome. Yet a collection of islands defended by feudal warriors had turned back his invasion with apparent ease. The Japanese interpretation of events was radically different. To them, the timing and intensity of the typhoon could only be explained as divine intervention. The gods themselves had risen to defend Japan against foreign invasion. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines that had prayed for deliverance now offered thanksgiving for what seemed an obvious miracle. The storm was given a name that would echo through Japanese history: Kamikaze, the divine wind. It was a term that captured not just the meteorological phenomenon that had saved Japan, but the belief that their islands enjoyed special protection from the heavens. This was not merely a lucky break in the weather, but proof that Japan was sacred ground, defended by forces beyond human understanding. Word of the miraculous deliverance spread throughout the archipelago, carried by messengers who could hardly believe the reports they bore. The mighty Mongol Empire, terror of the known world, had been turned back by wind and waves. Japan had faced its greatest test and emerged victorious, not through superior tactics or technology, but through what could only be described as divine favor. Yet even as celebrations echoed through Japanese towns and villages, cooler heads among the leadership understood a sobering truth. Kublai Khan was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. The resources of his empire were virtually unlimited, and his pride had been wounded by the failure of the invasion. The typhoon had bought Japan precious time, but it had not ended the threat from across the sea. The aftermath of the failed invasion sent shockwaves through the Mongol court that reverberated far beyond the immediate military disaster. Kublai Khan, accustomed to receiving reports of victory and conquest, found himself confronting something his empire had rarely experienced: complete and utter failure. The survivors who straggled back to Korean ports brought with them tales that seemed to border on fantasy. Ships torn apart by winds of impossible fury, warriors swallowed by waves the size of mountains, an enemy that commanded the very elements themselves. For the Khan, this was more than a military setback. It was a challenge to the fundamental assumption that had driven Mongol expansion for decades, that superior organization, tactics, and numbers could overcome any obstacle. The Mongols had conquered armies larger than Japan's entire population, had reduced mighty fortresses to rubble, had brought emperors to their knees. Yet a handful of islands had turned back his invasion with what appeared to be supernatural assistance. The psychological impact on the Mongol war machine was profound. Soldiers who had never questioned their invincibility now whispered about cursed waters and vengeful gods. The Japanese, it seemed, fought with divine protection, their homeland shielded by forces that no earthly army could overcome. These whispers spread through the ranks like wildfire, planting seeds of doubt in minds that had known only victory. But Kublai Khan was not a man easily deterred by setbacks, supernatural or otherwise. If anything, the humiliation of 1,274 only strengthened his resolve to bring Japan under Mongol control. The failure had made conquest a matter of personal honor, a test of his worthiness to bear the legacy of Genghis Khan. He would return to Japan, and next time he would come with such overwhelming force that not even the gods could stand against him. The years between 1,274 and 1,281 became a period of intense preparation on both sides of the Korea Strait. In China and Korea, vast resources were marshaled for what would be the largest naval invasion in medieval history. Shipyards worked around the clock, constructing vessels specifically designed for the assault on Japan. Weapons were stockpiled, soldiers trained, and supplies gathered on a scale that dwarfed the first invasion attempt. Meanwhile, Japan transformed itself into a fortress nation. The miraculous victory of 1,274 had united the country as never before, creating a shared sense of destiny that transcended regional rivalries. Every able-bodied man was put to work constructing coastal defenses, while the warrior class underwent intensive training to better counter Mongol tactics. The most impressive of these defensive preparations was the Great Wall of Hakata Bay, a massive stone barrier that stretched for nearly 12 miles along the coastline. Built in just 6 months through the combined efforts of thousands of workers, The wall stood over 9 feet high in places, its seaward face a sheer drop designed to prevent enemy landings. The inland side was sloped to allow mounted archers to ride along its length, turning the entire structure into a massive fortified position. Beyond the wall, Japanese engineers drove countless wooden stakes into the seabed at likely landing sites, creating underwater obstacles designed to tear the hulls from approaching ships. Fishing boats were converted into fire ships, packed with combustible materials and ready to be sailed into enemy formations. Even civilian populations received military training, transforming merchants and farmers into potential guerrilla fighters. The Japanese also made crucial changes to their military doctrine, abandoning the individual combat traditions that had proven so disastrous against Mongol group tactics. Samurai units trained to fight in coordinated formations, learning to suppress their desire for personal glory in favor of collective effectiveness. New weapons were developed specifically to counter Mongol advantages, including longer spears designed to keep enemy cavalry at bay and improved armor capable of stopping crossbow bolts. Perhaps most importantly, the Japanese developed new naval tactics designed to harass and weaken invasion fleets before they could establish beachheads. Small, fast boats crewed by fearless sailors would dart between enemy ships under cover of darkness, setting fires and cutting anchor cables. These tactics acknowledged a harsh reality. Japan could not match the Mongols in a direct naval confrontation, but they could make the invaders pay dearly for every mile of water they crossed. As 1281 dawned, both sides knew that the decisive confrontation was approaching. Kublai Khan's preparations were nearing completion, and Japanese spies reported massive fleet concentrations in Korean and Chinese ports. The second invasion would dwarf the first in every respect, bringing such overwhelming force to bear that no typhoon could save Japan from conquest. The Mongol fleet that assembled in 1281 was a marvel of medieval logistics and a testament to the Khan's determination to succeed where he had previously failed. 2 separate armadas converged on Japan from different directions, their combined strength representing the largest naval force assembled in human history up to that point. The Eastern Route Fleet, departing from Korea, carried 40,000 warriors across familiar waters, but it was the Southern Route Fleet from China that truly demonstrated the scale of Kublai's ambition. This second armada was built around the remnants of the Song dynasty's navy, captured when the Mongols completed their conquest of southern China. These were not hastily converted merchant vessels, but purpose-built warships designed for extended naval campaigns. The combined fleet numbered over 4,000 vessels of various sizes, from massive treasure ships capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers to smaller support craft loaded with siege equipment and supplies. The army they carried was equally impressive. Conservative estimates placed the invasion force at over 100,000 men, making it larger than most European nations' entire populations. This was not merely a military expedition, but a migration of conquest designed to establish permanent Mongol control over Japan. Engineers brought equipment for building fortresses, administrators carried plans for governing the conquered territories, and entire families of colonists prepared to establish new lives on Japanese soil. The technological advantages that had proven so effective in 1274 were present in even greater abundance. Gunpowder weapons had been refined and improved, with larger explosive devices capable of demolishing fortifications. Chinese engineers brought siege engines adapted for naval warfare, including catapults capable of hurling incendiary materials over defensive walls. Most ominous of all were the fire ships, vessels packed with combustible materials and designed to be sailed into enemy formations where they would explode with devastating effect. The invasion began in May 1281 with the departure of the Eastern Route Fleet from Korea. Following the same path as their predecessors 7 years earlier, they struck first at Tsushima and Iki Islands, overwhelming the defenders with sheer numbers. But this time, the Japanese were better prepared. Warning beacons flashed from island to island, carrying news of the invasion to the mainland hours ahead of the fleet itself. When the Mongols reached Hakata Bay on June 23rd, they found a very different reception awaiting them. The great stone wall stretched along the shoreline like a man-made cliff, its surface bristling with archers and spearmen. Underwater obstacles tore at the hulls of approaching ships, while fireboats darted out from hidden coves to attack the flanks of the invasion fleet. The battle that followed was unlike anything in medieval warfare. Mongol ships, unable to find suitable landing sites due to the wall and underwater obstacles, found themselves trapped in increasingly desperate fighting. Japanese defenders, secure behind their fortifications, rained arrows and rocks down on the crowded vessels, while small boats conducted hit-and-run attacks under cover of darkness. For weeks the struggle continued, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Mongols controlled the waters of the bay, but could not establish the beachheads necessary for a successful invasion. The Japanese held their defensive positions, but lacked the naval strength to drive off the massive enemy fleet. It was a deadly stalemate that consumed lives and resources at an alarming rate. As July turned to August, the strategic situation began to favor the defenders. The Mongol fleet, crowded into the confined waters of Hakata Bay, faced increasing problems with disease and supply shortages. Ships designed for rapid coastal raids found themselves serving as floating barracks for months on end, their holds becoming breeding grounds for illness and despair. Japanese tactics evolved to exploit these weaknesses. Night raids by small boats targeted Mongol supply vessels, while saboteurs attempted to start fires among the closely packed fleet. The defenders had learned from their previous encounter with Mongol warfare, adapting their ancient traditions to meet the demands of this new form of combat. The second kamikaze struck on August 15th, 1281, with even greater fury than the first. Once again, nature itself seemed to take sides in the conflict, unleashing winds and waves that no human army could withstand. The massive Mongol fleet, trapped in the confines of Hakata Bay, became a scene of unimaginable destruction as typhoon-force winds tore through their ranks like the wrath of the gods themselves. When the storm finally passed, the waters that had carried the largest invasion force in medieval history now held only wreckage and the bodies of the drowned. Of the 100,000 warriors who had sailed to conquer Japan, fewer than 20,000 would ever see their homeland again. Kublai Khan's dream of empire had been shattered not by superior tactics or technology, but by forces beyond human control. The kamikaze had spoken twice, and its message was clear. Japan would remain unconquered, protected by divine winds that rose from the sea itself. The Mongol Empire, master of half the world, had met its match in an enemy it could never defeat, the very elements that surrounded Japan's sacred shores. For 7 centuries, the memory of those divine winds would shape Japanese identity, creating a belief in their nation's special destiny that would endure through war and peace alike. The kamikaze had become more than a meteorological phenomenon. It had become proof that some lands are too sacred to be conquered, some peoples too blessed to be enslaved. The Mongols would never return to Japan. Their empire would eventually crumble, their dynasties would fall, but the legend of the divine wind would live forever. In the end, it was not the sword that saved Japan, but the storm. Not human courage, but heavenly intervention. The kamikaze had written its name in history with winds that roared like thunder and waves that towered like mountains. Thus ends the story of the Mongols' only defeat, a tale where nature itself became Japan's greatest ally. The divine wind had blown, and an empire's dreams lay scattered like driftwood on a distant shore.